Hi, and welcome to the Course Launcher Podcast, the beginner's guide to podcasting. I remain Samuel Ade, the chief troublemaker at Podlob, and your guide for this course. In today's Module 7, I will be showing you how to tag your podcast. And at the end of this module, you should be able to do just one thing, and that is to be able to correctly tag your podcast. So what exactly is tagging? Tagging simply means the process of adding extra information such as title, track number, album title, artist name, album network, artwork, comments, etc. to a file, in this case an MP3 file for display media players. Now this information are what we call metadata, and they are attached using ID3 tags. ID3 tags are created by softwares. Some softwares or media players can also add ID3 metadata to your MP3 file. You want to also remember that it is your podcast identity card. Your podcast cannot get missing with an ID3 tag. Just try and imagine a dog that got missing or a pet that got missing and there's no tag or collar around his neck. Such a dog is, even if I find that dog, or even if you find that dog on the road, there's no way you can return it back to the owner because it does not carry a tag. So your tag is essentially your podcast identity card. So why is tagging so important? Well, for one, it tells your listeners more about the podcast they're about to listen to. So if look at this image right in front of you right now. No lyrics, nothing, just so American. If this is the first time I'm listening to it, I don't know the voice of the artist. I don't know the artist. I don't know what the song is about. I don't have any lyrics. Your ID3 tag essentially tells your listener more about your podcast or more about the podcast they're about to listen to. Now, irrespective of the name change, all of all this information displays. Now, say for example, you already tag your podcast and someone changes the name to something else and tries to upload. The ID3 tag follows it. So when it's going to display on media players, it's not going to just display that name, but it will display the name. The name in the ID3 tag will override the name of the file. There are two different things. The name of the file, when you right click, you go to rename, that's the name of the file. But ID3 tag is not that. It's embedded in the MP3. So if the name of the file changes, the information remains the same. Now, it also influences the audience's decision to listen and subscribe to your podcast on iTunes. Say someone is searching for new podcasts to listen to on iTunes or any directory, say probably an app such as Podcast Republic or Podcast Addict, and all this pops up, it can influence their decision. So depending on what talks to them, depending on what they can relate to it, they can decide to listen to just any random podcast just because they're influenced by the artwork. Now, it also makes your podcast look professional. It looks like, oh, you had probably created in a great studio. It brands your podcast, what I would say in the next point. Now, take, for example, this podcast, for example. There is no artwork. All I have is RTV Region Monde. I don't know what RTV Region Monde is. Now come down to the name, to the episodes that you have down here. This is just, it gives me no idea about what the podcast is all about. If this had been properly tagged, the ID3 tag, the name of the podcast in the metadata, would replace all this name. So irrespective of the name you used in uploading it, it would have it properly named here. Then you can also have descriptions about your podcast. Remember this portion. Just remember this portion because it's going to be useful later on. Now, you see, you can't just have a great podcast without an ID3 tag. It also points people back to your website. Remember my story about the lost dog without a tag or collar? That's exactly what your podcast is. It's just a dog without a tag. So what are the softwares you can use for tagging your podcast? The very first one I want to talk about is the MP3 tag, which is free. Just go to and search free or MP3 tag download. And then you get to the website and you're able to download it. The second one is iTunes. It's free, but this is what I use because, of course, the largest directory, which is iTunes, is owned by the people who created, who made podcasts popular in the first place. Now, there is also ID3 Editor, which adds additional information to your podcast, and this goes for $15. If you're starting out, I won't advise you to go for ID3 tags. Either you stick with any of these two free softwares that you have down here. But this is what I would be using to tag the podcast in this tutorial. And this is what I use for all of my podcasts, and this is what I use to encourage everybody. Because if you tag in MP3 tag or ID3 tag and you upload to iTunes, because most times you have to submit your feeds to iTunes. iTunes adjusts all of the content. It recreates your ID3 tag to suit its directory. So why not use its own app to tag your podcast so that you can be sure that your ID3 tag remains the same? You can be sure of what your listeners would get. So what are the key information you need to provide when you're tagging your podcast? The very first one is the title, and that is your episode number and the title of that particular episode. For example, for Switch Podcast, the very first episode of Switch Podcast, you add S001, and that is Bruno's Place Story, the story of a banker turned entrepreneur. So you add the episode number, a code, and then you have the episode title. S standing for Switch Podcast. It could be anything. It could be your own podcast. And 001 standing as the episode number. This is followed by your the author name. Now, this is essentially your name and that of your co-host if it's co-hosted. In some cases, in some MP3 tags, it is called the artist name. So, for example, you have Samuel Adiri and you have some keywords in front of my name. Then there is podcast, which refers to the title of your podcast. Remember, this is not for the whole podcast show. It is the title of that episode in particular. And in some cases, it is called album. So it is the title of your podcast. That's the old podcast, I beg your pardon. Again, it is for the whole show. And in some ID3 tags, it is referred to as your album name. Then there is also the release date. Of course, that's very glaring. The date it was published on your website, that should be included. Then there's a genre where you can pick the exact genre of your podcast. Is it on entrepreneurship? Is it on online marketing? You could create one, and then you add it to MP3 tag. Now, comment. This is a short summary of your episode. It could be of your episode. Honestly, it could be of your podcast, but it should always contain your URL. Then there's the album artwork. That is your album, your podcast identity image. Add that to it always, all the time. And lastly, the description. This is a short description of what that episode is all about. So it could be, in this episode, we discussed so and so, we did so and so. So just try as much as possible to add all about this information in the right place so that you have a great MP3 tag. So what I'm going to do is to show you how to tag your podcast using iTunes. Alright, so we saved our trial podcast inside a folder the other time, and I remember we kept it on the recordings. Although I now remember that there should be, you could probably create another folder where you just say episode, or you don't even need it because you're filing by episodes already. So you could leave it in recordings or you bring it out to that folder. So this is it. Right click, head over to open with iTunes. Make sure iTunes is already installed on your laptop. And once you click that, it should launch iTunes and also launch your episode. So you pause this and then you head over to this where the three dots are, click on it for options and then get info. Now this is your MP3 ID tag. This is iTunes ID3 tag. Now, the first thing you need to do is to head over to options and change this media kind to podcast. Once you change into podcast, you can come back to to details and add all of your details. I already have my ID3 tag for Switch Podcast written somewhere. So most times I copy and paste for those options that won't pop up automatically in iTunes. So I click and I paste this. And once that's done, the author, which is myself, because I host the show. If it's a co-host, you would also have to add your co-host name to it. Now there's a little bit about there's a little bit more about, I beg your pardon, there's a little bit information you can add to your name, which can include your keywords, such as for me, keywords are my nickname, entrepreneurship, civil engineer, and all this. Now, some of them don't necessarily have to be what you are right now, but they have to be something you're working towards becoming, or at least have some basic knowledge about what it entails. So you keep it real. Then you also have the podcast, where you put your podcast name. For me, this is Switch Podcast. Once you have your name, then make sure it also contains keywords that describe what your podcast is really about. Now, once you're done, your release date, when do you intend to publish it, you leave it there. And then the genre where you can add, so this is entrepreneurship. You decide to add entrepreneurship. This is like tags, entrepreneurship, and then you leave it that way. And then, or if you don't have anything you want to, just change it to podcast. Yep, you don't fiddle with this, it's already there. Now, coming to your content box, this is where I add something like this: Switch Podcast and TV based channel was experienced. So this is what I put, and I make sure I also add my website URL. So, or you put something like copyrighted to so and so. Oh, why didn't it copy? So just going to copy this, and I'm just going to paste it here. So there you go. It should be short as possible, because the tag truncates very long. What's wrong with my laptop? Truncates very long comment. So the other thing you want to do is also add your description. Now, your description is basically about that particular episode. So in this case, I'm not going to change much. This is what the tag I used for the very first episode of Switch Podcast. In this case, because this is Bruno's Play Story, I'm talking about that particular episode. So in this particular episode, we focused on bringing you entrepreneurs. Okay, the Switch Podcast. I guess for today is Bruno Akino, arguably. And so depending, you could be very creative with this. Now, once you're done with this, you can head over to your artwork, and this is where you click on artwork and selecting what should be your podcast artwork. Now, they've changed this. This is no longer this is no longer 500, no longer 1,400 by 1,400. Like I said in previous ones, it's 3,000 by 3,000. I don't know why I've not changed this yet, but say this is 3,000 by 3,000 pixel. Make sure it is. Try as much as possible it is. You are virtually done with tagging your podcast. You leave sorting out because it automatically generates itself. File, it just tells you about the file size, the channels, mono, the bitrate, the sample, blah 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 blah, and then the sorting and all that. So once you're done, you click OK, and then you would see how it automatically changes in yes. So you can see now it's reflecting the name, the host name, the album artwork, and if I close this and open in MP3 in Windows Media Player, let me just play this. Wait for it. Exactly. So you see it's now branded, and then the name is here. So no matter what I name, that file in particular, it is not going to affect the MP3 tag. Let me show you. This is the file name. If I change this to anything, it won't affect this ID3 tag. Another very crude and raw way to add ID3 tag in cases where you're stuck and you don't have any of all the softwares is to come to properties. You can add tags to files. All you need to do is come to properties, add to details, and then you can add all this information one after the other. I don't normally encourage this because sometimes when I save it, I have to always check again to be sure that it actually saved the MP3 tag. So these are stuff you just need to know, because of course Windows can also add its own ID3 tag, although it's kind of unstable for me on my laptop. I'm not sure if it's the same for every other laptop, but not really reliable because I have to check it over and over again. So that's basically how to. Once you're done, I advise that you change this name to the name of your podcast. So let's say this is Pod Lopes Podcast, so I'm just going to say P001, and then I leave it that way. But because it's playing in another device, okay, yeah, I leave it that way, so that it can be consistent. URL of your download can always be consistent, and that's it. Congratulations to you. Yes, I want to say you deserve an award for that. Now I'm pretty sure that your podcast is going to be great, and I'm so proud to be part of that journey. Of course, I'm not going to let you go without you doing something. So this is what I want you to do. It's just one thing. I want you to tag that trial podcast you just edited using the iTunes media player. So if you don't have iTunes already installed on your laptop, download it and then use it to tag your trial podcast. If you have any questions or contributions, just email me at samuel@podlob.com. In our next Model 8, I will be sharing with you the different media hosting options and what I advise that you use in hosting your podcast. Of course, you're asking me, can't I just put it on my website? Don't worry, that question will be answered in Model 8. I remain Samuel Ade, the chief troublemaker at Pod Lob, and this is me saying, I'll see you in Model 8. Take care.